Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is this House would allow violent offenders to opt into Pavlovian conditioning as a substitution for prison time. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Bulgaria. And on the opposition, we have the team from Greece. From the proposition side, our speakers are, for the first speaker, we have Kaluyan. Second speaker, Valentin. Third speaker, Tanya. And again, for reply speaker, Valentin. On the opposition side, our speakers are first speaker, Leo. Second speaker, Alexia. Third speaker, Max. And again, for reply speaker, Alexia. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information, POIs, may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At the 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of the speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams, and now I hand over the floor to the chair judge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And welcome to the semifinals. Congratulations to both teams on making it this far. My name is Rebuttal, and I'll be your chair for this round. Pronouns are she, her. I will now invite my panelists to introduce themselves as they can.
My name is Alex. Congratulations for both teams and good luck.
Good luck, Lena Schiefer. Best of luck. Anna Schiefer, good luck. Perfect. If there are no questions, everyone is set. Audience, please do not make too much noise. It's a small room. If you make too much noise, you can't hear them. And speakers, when you're speaking, do remember sometimes it can be a echo, so mind your voice inflection as well. On Pavlovian, we'll now call on the first speaker for the proposition team.
Като запусне. Just a second. Okay. starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, imagine a world where every time a violent offender gets this treatment, there is one less offender who is going to recommit. There is one more family that thinks that at least there is one single person less, but also there is no one else who is going to feel the same due to this person not being any more a criminal. Not like on the comparative where we know that prisons aren't effective, where prisons are bad, where prisons don't do their job but are simply there to make people suffer, and this is the case that is going to come from proposition. Team line of prop then. Set up, then firstly on why less crime, violent crime is committed on our side, then why victims feel better on our side, and then why prisons are firstly better but due to having less crime in them, but also we save a huge chunk of money. So, then to set up. Firstly, everyone who actually committed such a crime will opt in for the simple reason that they don't want them to be taken out. It is pretty intuitive. Because, and therefore, any crime basically what actually we're talking about? We're talking about crimes where actually violence or basically intent of violence or threats of violence are actually there. For example, assault or threats to actually be shot if you don't give the money for a person, or I don't know, any sort of violent robbery, or I don't know, threats of you actually being shot for something else. Otherwise, if you don't opt in, you simply go to prison. Therefore, if they argue otherwise, then both sides become symmetrical. Therefore, both sides have to take their burden. This is kind of important. Okay, then, moving on to first argument then. Less future offenses happen on our side of the house. The setup of this argument is pretty intuitive. This argument is about what happens after you actually leave prison, right? What happens after these 2 years that you actually get when you actually just beat up somebody, or 10 years if you actually committed sexual assault, for example. This is factually true. If they want to argue that it is life sentence, good luck, this is just not the truth. Okay, then, why prisons doesn't stop you from future crimes and even makes you a worse person and actually more violent criminal? Firstly, you lose connections with family, friends, job, etc. Therefore, once I go out, I have nothing to go back to. First, because I have criminal record, therefore no one is going to employ me, but also I have bad reputation because stigma exists towards people who have been to prison. Therefore, I basically forced back to stealing because I simply have no other income. But also,
point of information.
No, sit down. Means that basically we have we desensitized to violence too. This is the second mechanism because prisons are violent. There are skirmishes there. There is basically extremely, battles for influence or gangs even. This means that you actually need to survive. Therefore, you actually do anything. Therefore, that means actually we have your survival instincts kicking in. Therefore, you actually get into jungle mode where you actually have to fight for your life. Therefore, you get extremely violent simply to survive, even if you're not that kind of person. But thirdly, you still remain in a gang after you get out because you have gotten out, but now you have nothing to go to. Therefore, you're either going to be threatened or your only friends are going to be from this gang that you have been in prison. Therefore, you actually still remain there, still recommit, because at the end of the day, you have to make something out after that. But finally, and maybe most important, now she's actually going to get more violent afterwards. Therefore, once you get out, the chances are even greater because now I'm even more likely to commit crime than violent crime than before. Okay. That is why, for example, over 50% in the US people actually recommit their crimes and also they're likely to be violent as I explained. Then why this actually method and conditioning fixes this? Firstly, on incentive. I want to stop the pain biologically. How our brain works, basically when you have, no please don't, okay anyway, meaning that obviously biologically we need to survive. Our brains have evolved in a way that actually we don't want to suffer pain because if pain actually equals suffering, which is something that our brain kind of biologically has made us to refuse it since that's how actually death, for example, is caused, etc. But the ability is pretty simple. I cannot beat up anyone or rob someone because I feel pain and nausea. When, for example, I break my hand, I cannot write. This is the same logic here. Meaning that the impacts of, meaning that we have far less crime on our side. What are the impacts then? He basically, on their side, he can recommit again. how does this look like? This impacts new lives who haven't been touched by crime before. Therefore, they go through the same exact trauma. But also, their families also suffer. For example, if, for example, a daughter is, beat up, therefore, all her family is going to struggle. But also, people's businesses where they have been robbed are going to be suffering too, because now, if, for example, they're poor and couldn't have afforded to reassure it, then they're actually screwed. But also, it will be even more severe. Why? Because I am a violent person, obviously, therefore, I want to basically seek my revenge. I have been radicalized in my prison cell because I have nothing else to do. But also, I am so used to violence because I have seen nothing else for the past 2 years. Therefore, it is basically, even if I'm a violent person to some extent, now I'm a more violent person in extreme ways. Then, why is this extremely important? Because future victims are more than the current ones, right? Because more and more people get born, therefore more and more people can actually be attacked. Therefore, if we prove that there are lives of victims at stake who are actually in the future who are more, then we win on violence by far. Moving on then, all victims feel better, but important notes here. Please acknowledge that they basically, we know that they'll talk about retribution, right? But here is the thing. People are extremely emotional where they actually feel such circumstances in violence. They're therefore irrational. And I would never believe the sentence is enough. How does this look like? If I get like 5 to 10 years for this case, if my daughter gets assaulted, it won't matter because if the criminal is taking these 5 years, I will want something harsher, like prison or death sentence in this way, because this person assaulted my daughter, dear panel. I want him dead. It is kind of intuitive. Therefore, this isn't as important of a clash because no matter the sentence, it will never be enough. I have no closure. I have no retribution. Therefore, at least we want to get something by getting someone to not commit anymore. Or I don't know, such people to actually not be on the streets, to actually have one less person to actually recommit such things and less people to feel this horror. Then, you know that this one, basically, let's go into mechanization. You know that no one is the future is will actually feel the same, will actually make you feel the same way. Why? Because I know this person wouldn't recommit. Why? Because the state actually wants me to feel okay, so they actually explain how this process works and I will never ever worry about it. But even if that's not the case, after some time we will have statistics that these people actually don't recommit and I'll know that this isn't the case. But also, this doesn't happen on their side of the house because I know that this person is still out there, and believe me, I'll know that I'm so paranoid. But also, I actually believe that maybe he wants to revenge in this way, therefore be even more paranoid. But what leads to what actually leads to closure? Because I feel empathy on our side of the house. Because at the end of the day, I have empathy towards myself and the potential new people who actually are going to get to the new victims. Because at the end of the day, one less beaten person means I have done my duty to actually protect one more person who has committed this. But also, I fear the revenge of the actor. Therefore, I actually know that this monster is going to search for me afterwards. I'll be in extreme paranoia because at the end of the day I have no control, but also I have fear. And when this combination actually acts, I am extremely going to be extremely anxious and paranoid and suffering. Please vote against that. Propose!
May I begin? Proposition creates a dystopian society in which people are irreparably lobotomized, tortured by the very criminal justice system that claims to care about justice, and against the will of society, which delegated the punishment of prison time. Proposition is cruel. Proposition is unjust. Proposition is the enemy of justice and restitution. Let's be clear about what this is actually about. Firstly, This is about committing violence and feeling nausea then, but it's also about thinking about violence. Not made clear by proposition. I will make very clear why that's very important. Secondly, this is severe nausea. For you to have the incapacitation that proposition requires, that you physically can't do the crime, alcoholics very often commit crime while under the influence of alcohol. They assault other people. So presumably this is a lot of incapacitation that they're doing, very, very severe nausea. That will become important later. But thirdly, Prop doesn't get the magic wand their way out of this. Maybe this is why they're afraid of the POI, because let me tell you how Pavlovian conditioning happens. It happens in a very specific way. You expose the patient to stimulus, in this case presumably images of violence, and then you punish them with things like an electric shock. So in their heads they connect the images of violence and pain. That is what creates the image of nausea that they so desire. I hope you begin to see how inhumane this is. What will our side do? Firstly, we will explain why proposition is inhumane and why that justice element here should be the priority of the debate. Secondly, we will talk to you, no thank you, about restitution, and Alexia will talk to you about harm. What does proposition's first speaker do? I want to, at the top, notice that nothing that he does actually tells you why they support an opt-in system. In fact, all of it is about incapacitation and about retribution. To that extent, I think they would be absolutely fine with just imposing this on patients. They have to tell us why that isn't the case, why they only support it in the cases of an opt-in. I think the reason why is because they value autonomy. I'll explain to you why theirs is a side that doesn't, that basically cripples autonomy. The second thing I want to note here is in terms of their argument, in terms of why prison is very bad and why this is something that you don't want to go in. Like the criminal record, you can't have a job, you can't provide it for your family. Skirmishes in the prison, you might be shivved. Firstly, instead of fixing this, proposition is forcing people to lobotomize themselves to get out of this. This is literally coercion. They did the argument for us about telling us why the alternative is something that coerces you into lobotomizing yourself. That sounds horrible. But secondly, these are issues you can face. No, thank you. This is like a US/El Salvador thing almost exclusively. Singapore has fixed this with a very retribution-heavy thing. Netherlands have fixed this with a very rehabilitation-focused system. Different methods can yield very good results, right? And obviously those are very good examples, but we think across many countries you don't have the type of horrible things that proposition describes. It is on their side that the state doesn't solve these horrible things and rather delegates this thing to the person lobotomizing themselves. But I will now show you in the first argument why violence and thinking of violence are a core part of the human experience. Therefore, it is unjust to allow people to lobotomize themselves in the way proposition allows. Why is violent thought rather, and violence a core part of the human experience? Firstly, because it's hardwired into you. It is the natural extent of the emotion of anger. When you found out your spouse cheated on you, or that your friend was assaulted, you get massive nausea on their side because you perceive yourself, because you think of that violence. The immediate reaction when you see or hear of your friend being assaulted, as they describe, by the way, when they tell you about the father wanting to put the person who assaulted his daughter in jail, the immediate reaction of that father is to think about violence against that other person. It is core to our identity. But secondly, no thank you, it is core to our imagination, to conceptualizing ourselves, the world around us, and our other identities. On proposition, you can think of violence. So, if you go under the treatment, right, if you lobotomize yourself. So you can't think of Jesus on the cross if you're religious. You can't think of the revolution that birthed your country. You can't even think about how a father you would fight to defend your kids. You can't think and conceptualize all of your other identities. Imagination is what allows us to be human, to think of the future, to think of who we are and our place in it. Thirdly, though, I think you don't have, to a large degree, a choice in thinking about violence. Action movies, ads, all of these things always talk about violence. Songs very often talk to you about violence. That's nausea, debilitating nausea on proposition. Versus, look, we get freedom of movement is important to people, right? Prison restricts your freedom of movement. That's an important right people have. The difference that we draw, though, is that freedom of movement is the right and the freedom that you have in order to achieve certain goals. I am able to go to church, for instance, because I have freedom of movement. The difference then that we draw with proposition and conceptualizing anger is that they are taking away your ability to conceptualize the things you want to do. Not only are they taking away your ability to do certain things with, prison time, they're taking away your ability to think of goals, to think of who you want to be, not just your ability to tackle those, right? And so we think then that freedom of, that this is just unjust fundamentally for the following, no thank you, it's unjust fundamentally for the following reasons. Firstly, because it is often coercive, Why? A, because people can't conceptualize what it would be like to not even be able to think of violence. We think that this is something that we don't realize how often we do it, so we can't even opt in sort of to some degree because we can't think of what it would be like. But B, because of, to a large degree, all of the pressures they tell you, right? Economic pressures. For many people, they have to get out of prison now in order to provide for their families, in order to make sure that their kids keep going to school and don't go to some broken orphanage. These are the things that you need to do very often. And we think this is the coercive pressure that forces people to lobotomize themselves, to not be able to conceive of themselves and of their future on side proposition. This is unusually cruel. But secondly, even if it is not actively coercive, even if this is a free choice, we think we don't allow people to choose to divorce themselves of a core part of their humanity. This is why we don't allow, for instance, people to the reason why is because what you become is no longer able to make choices, no longer able to be a functioning member of society when you're lobotomized, and so you are essentially killing your future self. This is why we don't allow you to sell yourself into slavery, for instance. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, that this is a horribly wrong practice. The state loses and society loses their moral authority to impose punishments on people. But secondly, and crucially, you're crippling the ability of these people to rehabilitate themselves. On proposition, if you want to reflect on what led you to commit the crime you did, you're thinking about violence. You're thinking about what were the thoughts that led you to commit violence, that therefore you're getting significant nausea. That is something that prevents people from accessing the ability to become better people, to not want to be violent in the future. I'll take the POI now.
I believe it is good to stop violence. That's why, for example, we forbid Nazi parties from existing, even though this is limiting people's ability to express themselves or whatever.
Okay, I get the POI. Yeah, cool. First of all, I'm not even sure we limit Nazi parties, as he says in many places. Secondly, I don't think being a Nazi person is core to your humanity, as I just explained conceptualizing violence is. Thirdly, I'm now going to explain why we think the priority of this debate should be justice, and that is quite simply that on proposition, presumably they agree that there are certain restrictions and certain punishments that we can impose. We don't support probably cutting your hand off for stealing. We don't support doing horrible things to you or torturing you. Why? Because we recognize that these punishments are unjust, even if they would probably lead to greater deterrence. Therefore, we think the priority of this debate should be justice. I will finally tell you why proposition harms the restitutive function of the criminal justice system. We think the punishment of X years was chosen for a purpose by the judge or the jury. The reason was that this was the harm that was caused to society by your actions. We think allowing or even forcing a criminal into a different punishment is wrong because it denies recognition of the pain to the victims. The person who murdered their boyfriend gets the same punishment as someone who assaulted someone else. That is fundamentally not recognizing the differences that exist in every crime. That is wrong. That is not something the criminal justice system should stand by. Don't allow people to lobotomize themselves. Vote opposition.
Thank you for that speech. The continued debate will now come to the defense of our team proposition.
This speech will start on my next one. The idea of the justice system is to make people never do crime, rehabilitate victims. This is the idea of the justice system. If we prove that these things are good on our side of the house, then we have a moral justice system. Therefore, their arguments don't stay in the debate because the morality of the justice system is fundamentally subjective outside of these two things that I just explained. What we're going to hear in this speech, firstly, on the two questions, this debate, to continue a bit on how this thing is going to look like because they question it, I have to explain it now. But secondly, on the morality of these things, and thirdly, as to why prisons will become better places. Let's firstly begin with the clarification of how this thing will look like. They say every time you get severe nausea. We believe this to be fundamentally unrealistic and uncharitable to our case. Why? Because nausea will most probably be proportional to the total crime you have done. This is extremely likely because, as they say, this is a mechanization that creates this sort of particular thing. This means that if I think of something, most probably the impact on my brain will not be as severe as if I do something violent. Most probably if I see it on an action movie and not even think about it without any sort of a real person, the effect won't be as big because it's something imaginary when I see it on the movie. While if I don't see it on the movie, then it will be severer. It's on a spectrum of how much you feel nausea, directly mitigating all of their practical claims in this way. Right. Then they say...
Point of information.
Later. Then they say you expose them to violence. Notice, this is what creates it in this sort of particular way. Like they say, why not impose it? Notice, here is the refutation to their moral point. We don't own these people choice. Firstly, this may sound very scandalous, but they also don't give them choice. They send them to prison, right? So we don't own these people choice. Let's begin with this. Why is this the case? Because you don't give them that as well. These people have broken the social contract, the contract with the state, so the state can choose to not protect them from this sort of particular thing, to give them a certain punishment that fits this sort of particular thing. Right. So having in mind they have broken the contract, then we can take away the choice. But we are more charitable than them. We actually give them choice. We say, okay, they can choose between prison and this sort of specific thing. We believe that later. We believe everybody will choose this specific conditioning, but at the end of the day, we give choice, we give more autonomy. So if this is the metric they want, then I think that something coercive is better than no choice at all for autonomy. I think this is kind of intuitive, right? And then, what else can I say about this? Notice they say, you will continue thinking about it because it's in the human nature and all these things. Notice, you get used to not thinking about it. My first speaker explains this. My first speaker says that avoiding pain and suffering is the most fundamental biological instinct. This is why we change things about our lives. So if you think, we can take them at their best and say that you're going to feel incredibly bad. But this is only for a short period of time. I'm not conceding anything, this is even if, right? This means it will only be for a short period of time, which basically means that this is severely mitigated because you adapt, as my first speaker already has explained. Right. And then the big impact is you can't watch an action movie. Guys, come on, let's be serious. We are talking about life. We are talking about assault. We are talking about victims of crimes that they did not consent to, which is also pretty immoral if you ask me in this sort of particular way. Right. Then, let's continue to what else they tell us. They tell us rehabilitation can't happen on our side. Guys, rehabilitation happens with us as well. The point of rehabilitation is to not make the crime again. Guess what? You will never make the crime again on our side of the house. This seems pretty rehabilitatory to me in this sort of particular way. Right. Then, what is the weighing? If we take their best case and say that there is some sort of immoral thing happening here, I'm not sure if this is the case, right? Let me tell you that crime is also very immoral, but the way crime is immoral is much bigger because it also has practical impacts. So if we have morality of crime being wrong and there are only moral points, then you should weigh it with us because we also have practical impacts of all of these things. Go.
We showed you why thinking of violence is core to you conceptualizing yourself and the world. You say just don't think about these things. Do you see anything wrong with that?
No, I say you get used to it. Like humans have gotten used to absolutely everything in their lives. We have evolved a lot. People can choose what they can think about panel. You can choose whether you listen to me right now or you don't listen to me right now. You can choose whether you buy this or not buy this, even though I recommend buying this because it's kind of more analytical than their whole think of, this is how you conceptualize things. I conceptualize myself in so many other things. I conceptualize myself in things I do. I conceptualize myself in things I enjoy doing. Come on, they have to prove a lot more for them to have a principle in this debate. Right. Then let's continue to our third argument of prisons becoming firstly better, but also not requiring as much funding, which is, I think, very much crucial. Notice why with them prisons require a lot of funding and are generally violent. Firstly, they require a lot of funding because you need to feed the people on a daily basis 3 times a day. Food is expensive, we know this, I don't need to prove this. But secondly, you need to build prisons. Notice, this changes things when change things when they're broken. For instance, when a bed breaks, you need to buy a new bed in this sort of particular case. But also, why are prisons incredibly violent? Because of the violent offenders that go there. Like the financial scammer is most probably not going to do violence because he has not shown a tendency to exhibit violence beforehand. He doesn't have the ability to do this, or at least we believe he doesn't have the ability to do this because he has not done a violent crime where he could have done a violent crime. He has chosen to scam people in this sort of particular way. Right. So prisons require money and are miserable because these violent offenders often start riots in prisons because they want because they have to let their emotions out. These violent offenders often beat up other people in prison because they were on their nerves, for instance, or didn't want to give them their lunch in this sort of particular case, didn't respect them enough, didn't look at them enough, and all these sort of things. Like, at the point at which these people, and guess what also, this kind of seems immoral, you know, to get beaten up in prison, kind of also very immoral, like if we want to speak about morals. Great, no. Great, so why we does this is better. Firstly, notice how these violent offenders are outside of prison. This means that now these violent offenders cannot start riots. These violent offenders cannot beat up other inmates, and it's much less likely for somebody that has never beaten people up to start beating people up than somebody who has the tendency to beat people up to beat people up, you know. Then, what happens then? Secondly, there are less prisoners overall. So you need to pay food for less prisoners. You need to, the prisons are less overcrowded because there is a problem with overcrowding in prisons because simply there aren't enough buildings because generally speaking, it's not very populistic to say I'll give more money to the prisons because people believe these people deserve suffering. So mostly politicians don't give a lot of money to the prison system, right? Then, notice, what are the impacts of this? There are less miserable conditions for the non-violent offenders. They don't get beaten up in prison, they don't install riots that they can get stabbed in this sort of particular way, and we believe this is fundamental and moral. Why? Guess what? The judge has given them this sentence, the judge didn't give them the sentence to get stabbed with a knife, so taking by their logic, it's kind of immoral for me to get stabbed by a knife in prison, right? Because the judge didn't give me this. Then, what happens? Secondly, notice how there is less violence in prison, which means that now these people will not radicalize further. Because as my first speaker explains, when you see violence everywhere, when you are part of a gang, you are pushed to your limit. Now these financial scammers, for instance, like every other side of non-violence, are not pushed to their limit. So they don't begin doing violent crime. If you want to be moral, but also practical, vote for us.
Nope, I got it. Proposition doesn't get to wave a magic wand and tell you that somehow, randomly, without explaining to you how, this nauseousness is going to be proportional to the kind of violence that you think of, and it's also going to be cherry-picked for what you see and for the distinction as to whether this is going to be a film or not. Let me explain to you how Pavlov did his experiment. He took a bunch of dogs, he rang a bell, and he brought food on the table. And what that did is that it allowed the dog to connect the idea and the sound of the bell to food. At which point, when Pavlov took away the food and rang the bell, he saw the dog salivate because it connected the sound of the bell with the idea that this means that it will eat. What proposition is doing is that it is necessarily causing people nauseous to the point where they feel so nauseous, where they're incapacitated completely, by exposing them, no thank you, to images or feelings or violence. They cannot make this distinction feasibly by the point in which they're trying to train human beings to respond to any stimulus of violence with having spasms, with having their stomach be so severely bad to the point where they fall on the floor and turn purple and God knows what, so that they do not commit that crime. Therefore, what proposition is doing is that it's torturing people forever with something that is irreversible as per the info slide of the motion. They're lobotomizing people and they're doing this for eternity so that the person never offends again. If this is a world that you want to live in, problem. But clearly it's not, because it's immoral, because it's inhumane, and it's because it's monstrous, no thank you. And no person deserves this, because we as a society have placed limits on the kind of punishment that people receive. So even if this is something that people choose, there is limits to this choice. This is why, for example, we don't allow people to sell themselves into slavery, or we don't want people, for example, to have their hands cut off, even if we think that they deserve it in theory. We don't do this as a society because we understand there are limits to justice and limits to punishment. We stand for prison time because this is not just what the courts decided, this is what society decided is just. And when people opt out of that, and when people choose an alternative punishment, no thank you, even if it's better, even if it's worse, it is not consistent with society's values. Two things then in this speech. Firstly, some rebuttal, which is going to take out all of Prop's arguments at the point where, by the way, all of their impact scale with how many people opt in. They never explain how many people opt in. If anything, they do the analysis for us, tells people will be coerced into this. This is really, really horrifying if you listen to my intro. And secondly, my own argument as to why this has significant third-party harm. First thing that I want to address, right? Because the first thing that they tell you is that prison is really, really bad. They tell you lose connection with family, prisons are violent, and apparently you have gangster friends, and this is the only person you can hang out with after you come out of prison. But I want to bring some reality to this debate and tell you that there's a spectrum which exists for violent crimes. That is to say, that 40% of violent crimes that exist in the US vary from, for example, one-to-one assault at a bar, all the way to, for example, more consistent abuse, such as domestic abuse. The more extreme cases would be like, Jeffrey Dahmer, really, really bad. But we think this is the minority of cases which exist. The majority exists within that side of the spectrum. Now, why is this important? Because prison is really important for both sides of this spectrum. Why? Firstly, because there's a government incentive to do rehabilitation under our side of the house. In the terms of the capital and the money that we would be using, they're using this to lobotomize people, get doctors, no thank you, and get electric chairs. We're using that money to invest in that rehabilitation. We have the fiat to do this. But secondly, because under our side of the house, prison is better because the individual, in the vast majority of cases from this side of the spectrum, can understand and override the feeling of anger that drove them to disrespect the law in the first place. We allow them to reflect, we allow them to talk about this with psychologists, we allow them the time to think about this, because by the way, we don't make them fall on the floor at the first thought which they have. The third reason is because prison, no thank you, we think is enough of a deterrent in the status quo at the point where in the most extreme cases that they talk to you about, it's very, very long. We think this deters people enough to the point where they can make the decision to not actually enact the crime. But even if they override that deterrence, we think it is so much better when in prison they are actually able to override that. Their side is the one which, by the way, even if we don't deter people, eventually after they come out of prison, they're unable to self-defend. The individual that, by the way, did a one-time crime in which they hit a guy at the bar, under their side and from their model, the next time that they will need to self-defend for whatever reason, they can't do this because they're going to drop on the floor and turn purple and their eyes are going to go crazy because you're literally lobotomizing them. This is inhumane and this is causing so much more crime in the sense that if people can't self-defend from future crimes, you also have lower the ability for them to be able to escape that crime in the first place. Secondly, then, on victims feeling better, which, by the way, is very, very patronizing for you to assume that victims want to inflict this horrible pain that is eternal on people. Because note, this isn't just monitoring your thought, by the way, all of the time. It is also something that is extended, which is to say that this is something that is irreversible. So their side is when a victim places punishment, irrespective of the magnitude of the crime. So whether I did the bar thing or whether I'm Jeffrey Dahmer, same thing for proposition. And by the way, it is forever. I have this nauseous reaction for eternity. Very patronizing for you to assume this is what victims want, even though they felt the pain of what it means to actually be violated. This is horrible. But secondly, right, if it is the case that courts decided that the right decision is for this person to go to prison at the point where the individual has the choice to opt out of it, this is really bad because victims don't find comfort in the fact that someone gets to play around with what punishment they will face, even if they think it's worse because they're guilty, or even if they are not quite sure how badly this lobotomy is and they choose it because they think it's easier. Giving these people choice is really bad, and victims are much less likely to want this. Lastly, very quickly, on prisons, they tell you it's expensive. By that same logic, would you also kill them? Would you also torture them because they take space, send them to an island? No, because as a society, we understand that that is absurd, and there are limits to what you do to the people that commit crimes, even if it is the most extreme. But obviously, in the cases where people are very violent in prison, no thank you, you still put a detention in them, right? You lock them up for like a day. This is something that works. They don't tell you why prison time is something so insufficient that they have to do this immoral thing to people across the scale, regardless of what crime they did. My own argument then as to why Pavlovian conditioning places a disproportionate burden on third parties at the point where it's extremely traumatic and disruptive to everyday life. And note this is going to deal with the vast majority of cases where people, for example, were convicted of manslaughter for a car crash, or they fought at a bar, or because they engaged with violence because of drug use. The first reason why there's third-party harm is because practically it limits the activities with which you can engage in. For example, you can't go out with your family because you know that, for example, there's a risk of you having a nauseous attack outside, or you're consistently worried about the stimuli that you might have. The second is financially. Every time you have this, your family is going to have to consistently call an ambulance, call a doctor, because obviously this is going to have health effects that are going to make your body go nuts. But thirdly, emotionally, are you telling me that your coworkers and your peers are going to watch you like weep on the floor every single time you think about violence? This is insane. It's so traumatic on those around you at the point where it's so unfair because they didn't choose this. You chose to have this for you, but the rest of society didn't. Those who see you and deal with the aftermath didn't. On the side of humanity, opposition.
Being sexually assaulted, being beaten up, these are things that are intuitively your right not to happen to you. These are things that proposition is standing against, and things that are the reasons today you are proposing. I must admit, I was touched by these speeches, but unfortunately, this is not a theater. It was beautiful, it was amazing. However, dropping examples and impacting something that you never actually explained why is the most important thing, but rather explain what is important, they run from the responsibility to be comparative, and they run from the responsibility to actually prove their mechanisms, rather than just giving examples and illustrating until forever. So, what's proposition going to do in this speech? Firstly, on the principal clash, by simply, firstly, rebuttal, and secondly, outweighing the criminals as actors that we should care about, and secondly, rebuttal and why we should win this debate. First, let me clear up what you have from proposition in each side of the debate. First argument, we explain to you why we're literally saving lives. We're saving new people from being harmed. We're saving these people from experiencing things that literally limit their body autonomy, that limit their dignity. Things like being, for example, beaten up are things that you didn't have control over, and things that harm you both physically and mentally. We believe that as the criminal justice system, it is our main goal to limit these sort of things. Secondly, we speak on retribution. We explain to you why the victims will feel better when they feel like they have done a good deed, when they feel like they aren't going to live in paranoia for the rest of their lives, that this monster is going to come and harm them again, when we explain to you why this is probable, and simply through the prism of the perception of these victims and how exactly they feel, never engage with. Thirdly, on prisons, we explain to you why the prisons will become less violent, which then results into these criminals not being as radicalized when it comes to their actions after being let out of prison. Because let's face it, guys, they will exit prison at some point. The majority of life sentences are not the case. The majority of time, if you do something, even if you are a sexual assault, you get 10 years max. So when these people exit, we should care about what they're doing. Okay, not a rebuttal of their principled arguments. Firstly, let's bring some nuance into what they're talking about. They say it's in your nature to think about violence later. Sure, but what people are they talking about? I don't understand. They're talking about offenders that are already convicted. This person already harmed someone. This person already, for example, committed an armed robbery, so we know who to give this sort of medications to. These are people that are already criminals, and when you have cleared that up, rebuttal as to why the principle doesn't work. First of all, by the extension of their logic, these people don't control what they're thinking about, so they shouldn't suffer for it. Okay, so why should we send them to prison where they're intuitively going to suffer when these thoughts transition into actions? And this is something that we have proven in our argument as to why this sort of medication is effective and why it prevents. Even they concede that this medication literally prevents you from thinking straight and you having life abilities. Therefore, you probably concede to the fact that you cannot reoffend simply because you don't have the physical ability to do so. When this is true, we don't believe that it is moral by their logic to send these people to prison where they're limited of their freedom, when they're limited not only of, stripped only not from freedom of to what they think, because their social group is bad, because the environment is depressing and all of these things, but you're also restricting their ability. You can't go out, you can't choose what activities you do in prison. So these people are much more limited on their side of the house, even if you choose to care about these people. Again, by the extension of their logic, they must explain as to why this sort of treatment is much worse than prison, which they comparatively never do. They just impact why it's bad, which, by the way, leads me to the next call out, which is that this contradicts their second claims. When they're trying to claim that, oh, but it's too little, but then it's too much. For example, it's too little of a punishment to give this person the pill and give them sort of medication, but then it's too much for them for it to be principled. You have to either buy their first argument or the second. Go ahead.
If it were true that it would decrease crime by 10%, that's a big number, would you cut off the legs of people who commit serious assault?
Of course, very happy to do that. Why? On to weighing. I don't care about these people. I could not care less. Why? Simply weighing as to why the actors on our side of the house, which are the basic civilians, which is you, which is me, are more important than this person who is an already criminal. First point of weighing. These are immoral actors. This is something that comes even in our second speech. These actors, for example, limited the body autonomy of another individual, limited their rights. Therefore, it is justified for us to limit their rights, which is why prison exists and the concept of the criminal judicial system exists. It's okay for us to limit them when they have limited the rights of someone else. So they never explain as to what's the problem there. But comparatively, we must care more about the members of the public because they obey the law, because they sacrifice their full freedom, for example, to obey the law and to live by certain by certain rules in their life, just to have that freedom, and they deserve to have that. But secondly, these citizens are functional citizens and part of society. These people are working, these people are obeying the law. On the comparative, prisoners either stay in prison forever, where they do nothing but just sit there and don't contribute to society in any way, or secondly, they just exit prison and join gangs which are actively harming the state that society is in. So what is the bottom line here, dear panel? The bottom line is that when we don't care about the actor, we shouldn't care about the severity that this actor is suffering when we prove a more important actor that is suffering much more. Which leads me on to my next point of weighing. When on our side of the house we're preventing crime from happening, we're preventing things from, for example, from people being killed, from people being sexually assaulted. We believe these are things that come so much deeper than you just getting nauseous and falling onto the floor a few times. They present rehabilitation as a thing that exists, but they never explain as to why it works. Sure, the state does it, but why is it effective? We explain to you why it is not effective when radicalization in prison exists, when these people are not willing to admit to themselves that they did something wrong in order not to feel terrible for themselves as preventive mechanisms. This is something that they never prove in our case states in that sort of way. Then they say that, oh, but some victims don't want it. Okay, but some victims do want it. So what we bring to you in this debate is a comparative as to why the future victims are more important than retribution of the old victims. And why is that the case? Firstly, for the future victims are far more in number than the current victims, because when this person exits prison and for killing like beating up one person, he is going to exit and beat up another person and then another person. Second point of weighing, we believe that our case proves why the severity of these crimes will actually increase after this person has went to prison, due to radicalization, due to him having no other choice. So when you have this acceleration of impact, if you buy that they're equally important, when our gets worse over time, you should protect the people when more violent crimes are to happen. But thirdly, on solvency, what is moral and what is not is up to every single person in this room's judgment. Everyone has their different life story, versus practice is something that we agree upon. We agree upon that everyone in this room should live. We agree upon the fact that everyone in this room has the body autonomy, not to be sexually assaulted, not to be beaten up. So if you believe that the most important thing in this debate is to protect the most fundamental human right, which is to be protected by your state, which is to have your life, which is to have your dignity, you should vote for the most important fact that you are protecting the normal citizens, and today you are proposing.
Thank you for that speech. We're now going to have speaker continue.
By the end of 1984, Winston's mind was cleansed. And it didn't matter that he had no bad thoughts. It didn't matter that he was executed, because at that point, he was no longer a human. He was no longer someone with agency, with a capacity to think, with a capacity to self-actualize, to perceive what it is to be human, to perceive what it is to be himself. That is never something we can take away from people, and that is why you should vote on opposition. If you believe that your humanity is an innate right you can't take away from yourself, an innate right that the state can't coerce you into giving away. I'll talk about three questions in this speech. First of all, what are the constraints of the justice system? Second of all, why propositions measure stripped humanity in a coercive way? And third of all, I will engage in very direct weighing of why ours should be the priority. But let's first address the biggest and largest flaw with propositions' argumentation. That the motion calls on them to defend choice, that they would allow people to opt into this system. But none of their arguments are about that choice. All of their arguments are about how this is a good form of punishment, how it is better at incapacitating, how it is better at making the victims feel whole. And they say that this is the priority. By logical extension, then, if this is the priority, then they should not defend allowing people to opt into that. They should defend forcing that on people. And note, what opposition needs to prove in this debate is not the motion. So even if we concede all of their first speech and tell you this is a good punishment, we should give it to everyone, then opposition takes this debate because their case is not about the motion, their case is about the info slide, and these are two distinct things. Let's say you don't believe this attack. Let's say you believe that proposition does still have like a reasonable case, even though it is entirely logically inconsistent to give these people the option. Now, thank you. First, what are the constraints of the justice system? We think we respect the basic dignities of human. The basic dignities that civilizations have fought very hard to get from their state. The state which did use to execute people out in the streets for stealing apples to feed themselves. We fought hard to get to the point where the criminal justice system has these constraints. Why? Because it's not just about the criminals panel. Society is represented by the system it chooses to enforce. And that as a system, no citizen consented into. Did they offend or did they not offend means that that society still represents you, that the policing, that the punishment is one which is done in the name of the people. And you can't taint the name of the people by stripping others of their humanity in their name. That is the first reason as to why we have constraints on the criminal justice system. No, thank you. And the second reason we have constraints on the criminal justice system is because very often it gets it wrong. It gets it wrong when it over-prosecutes and convicts African Americans on 3 times the likelihood of a white American. It gets it wrong when 15% of convictions for the death penalty are later overturned after the fact, even though the person was executed. And because it disproportionately caters to affects the poor who can't access legal defense and the minorities who are victims of discrimination, it is why we should say, err on the side of caution. Make sure punishment isn't irreversible. That is why we do not take away people's legs proposition. That is insane. And third of all, because it enters a slippery slope. Now, slippery slopes are generally bad faith arguments, but we don't need to do that because they accepted the slippery slope, that by their logic they would cut off people's legs because they were convicted, even though that conviction might later be overturned. They would also, by the way, realistically be okay with preventative policing, punishing people before the crime happens, imposing a curfew so people don't go outside, because guess what, proposition? Night is when most crime happens, so you wouldn't want people risking all of that to prevent all of these victims from happening. You are probably the people who would also arrest someone before they convict a crime because some sort of algorithm or statistic has proven they are more likely to reoffend. Even though we think this might prevent victims, we think that the oppression of the state needs to be limited by these constraints because the state has a much greater capacity to coerce you than any other citizen because of how asymmetric that relationship is. How does then their form of punishment strip humanity? Because I think it does something very simple. It strips a basic element of life, an element of life which is in religion, which is in media, in advertisement, in your national identity, culture, etc. And we think this is not something you can scale, because the info slide very clearly says severe nausea if think about violence. They don't get to have this sort of scale of severity. And they tell you that, look, and this isn't, by the way, just about violence, because the brain would go into self-defense mode. It can't compartmentalize. Therefore, every thought which is tangential to violence would be eventually washed out. You would eventually cleanse your mind off of all of that, and you're losing so much of your capacity to think, so much of your capacity to engage with reality. They try to make a parallelism between this and the movement and the freedom of movement, which we limit. But the freedom of movement is logically secondary to your freedom to set priorities by having thought. You move because you want to do things. You can only want to do things if you can think. And we think, look, you don't always have control over your thoughts. You do over your actions. That is another distinction. And we can only punish you for those actions because those have caused harm. We think that the thoughts themselves are harmless. They are innately human. And that is what you're stripping away. I'll take the point.
Understand that if you cannot do the punishment, then don't do the crime. You have a choice, therefore your principal argument is not important. Because you actually opted into this, you actually did this crime, therefore you actually are a bad person and you should be punished to the severest extent if you actually committed sexual assault.
Their logic would use the death penalty on everything. If you know the punishment means it is okay to inflict upon you, so long as there is a paper notice somewhere saying death penalty applies for all, they would apply that. That is the level of oppression and coercion Team Proposition stands up to defend. And we think that yes, you might deter crime, anywhere from bicycle theft to a bar fight to sexual assault, but that is not the society and that is not the oppression we want to live in. Let's engage then in a bit of weighing. First of all, certainty. We think that there are a lot of ways of getting people not to reoffend. In a lot of countries, the rate is about as low as 15%. However, there is certainty that the lobotomy will be catastrophic to you. Second of all, the magnitude of harm, because the majority of violent crimes are not sexual assault or murder, they are getting into a bar fight. They are like violent theft, things which might be traumatic, but do not strip the basic elements of your humanity, and we think that the punishment should be proportionate to the level of harm you have caused the other person. When you're coercing people into taking such a massive harm, you are not being proportionate. And lastly, alternatives exist. There are other ways of limiting crime. This is the reality which we brought you in first, and we often manifest. Proposition 2 tells us that people don't want to fund prisons because they think criminals deserve bad things, but we think that people are also afraid of crime. This is why policing and getting limitations of crime are oftentimes the top voting priority anywhere from national to municipal elections, which is why people accept the necessary funding for bad people, for quote-unquote bad people, so they can build prisons that can actually contain them. This is why we don't just line up the firing squad and shoot every criminal, because people understand that this is a worthwhile sacrifice. And lastly, they tell you about, oh, you're going to start fights and you're going to make prison worse for everyone. We put people in special detention for this. Solutions exist. If someone is being violent in prison, they are taken in a different place where they can't affect violence. Okay, so what is this debate very clearly about, dear panel? They tell you they try to get fewer victims. We don't know, and in reality, maybe they do. But what we do get is we ensure the state doesn't strip you and doesn't take away the most basic of your humanity. And for that reason, we are not countries like Iran, which execute people for crimes. We are not the type of country which chops off your legs for criminality. And that is the type of society you want to live in if you're a criminal or if you're someone who gets wrongly convicted of a crime. Very proud to oppose.
This debate was never about the criminals independently or the victims independently. This debate is about what we as a society, collectively in this room, want to signal in the criminal justice system. Whether we want people to be able to choose their punishment and override what the court and thereby the representative of society wants, and whether we want that punishment, even if people chose it, to be one that is monstrous, to be one that is lobotomy-like. And at that point, I think it's very clear on opposition that humanity and society says no to both of these things. This is why we have courts that decide. This is why we have prison and attempts to improve that prison. But at the end of the day, this is why we have definitive decisions and why we follow through with these. Two questions then. Is this something that is just? And this will also address the impact on the victims. And secondly, do they actually get incapacitation compared to our side of the house? But I just want to establish that justice is the priority of this debate at the point where we are all individually giving power to the justice system. Because honestly, it's funded by our taxpayer dollars, but also it is representative of the values that collectively we have. That is why, for example, countries that don't have the death penalty is because that is reflective of the views of that society. But secondly, it has to do with the magnitude to which people are able and want to concede to this. That is to say that even if the individual criminal wants this, even if the individual victim wants this, quantitatively, this is not what society stated it would. Otherwise, this would have been something that the court decided. The court would have decided that you deserve to be lobotomized in the first place. It wouldn't have given you the option to opt into this. First question then, on is this just? We told you it is not for 4 very simple reasons. The first is that it strips away a core part of your humanity. It strips away your thought. And that is important because a lot of the time we do think about violence irrespective of whether we committed a crime. And so the individual that may have gotten involved in that bar fight will still inevitably think about violence. We have this in our everyday language. I'm gonna kill that guy. We say that all the time. It's intrinsic to who we are. And therefore, not only is it first impossible for you to not think about violence, which basically means you're going to be not just all the time at the point where you're not just preventing crime, you're preventing existence. But secondly, even if this is something that you can just simply not think about, this is taking away your humanity. And the state, and therefore the criminal justice system, has a responsibility to treat people as humans. This is why we don't allow people to become slaves. We want people to be treated as human beings with the bad and the good things that it comes with. The second reason why it's unjust is because it overrides the court's decision. Necessarily for this to be an opt-in system, it overrides them saying that you deserve prison time for 5 or 10 or 15 years. This is what was decided. Why do you get to override this? They don't give you reasons as to why this should be the case. Thirdly, because this is the same irrespective of the crime. That is to say that whether I got into a bar fight or whether I'm a sexual assaulter or whether I'm Jeffrey Dahmer, it is the same. And I think that this is so much harmful. First, because it's very patronizing to victims to assume that this is what they want in the vast majority of cases. But secondly, their pain isn't respected. The victims who were hurt by this don't necessarily want this to be the case. But thirdly, in terms of the potential nebulous victims that they say they're preventing, what about your regular person that also got into that bar fight but in the future cannot defend themselves? What if they are a victim in the future? They are also future victims. Just because you made a mistake and you were violent, which is intrinsic to human being, doesn't mean you deserve to be nauseous forever and become the victim yourself. But fourthly, in a lot of instances, people are wrongly incapacitated, such as black individuals. Lastly, do they get more incapacitation? We told you simply they don't. Why? Because they're necessarily not investing in things like rehabilitation. Because if prison is so bad, that's enough of a deterrent. But if prison is not so bad, that means that rehabilitation exists on our side of the house and it can work. Proposition.
This speech will start on my next work. Panel, the side of opposition really likes false dilemmas. Let me also offer you one. Would you cut the legs of an innocent person or would you cut the legs of a criminal if you were given the choice? Most probably you would pick the criminal. What does this mean? This means in society we value the rights of innocent people comparatively more than the lives of criminals in this sort of way. So if we prove a delta in the lives of innocent people, you should always prioritize their rights rather than the rights of convicted criminals. Okay, what we're going to hear in this speech? Firstly, a few things you should not buy because they were never explained from their side. Secondly, 4 comparatives as to why you should vote for us. Notice what are the things. Firstly, on the rehabilitation point, they need to prove why rehabilitation is effective. Come on, they just say rehabilitation exists, it happens, they need to prove why it's effective. This is debate, they never prove efficiency. Secondly, the whole dog story, like, you don't know this, I don't know this, you as an average informed voter don't know things about dogs and things that are outside of the info slide for this specific thing. Come on panel, we're debating a hypothetical motion in an info slide. The average informed voter doesn't know the story. So, but I gave you logical reasoning how this process is likely to look like. I explained to you, milder cases will most probably not have such an effect on your neurons. This is something I did in second speech. You should always prioritize the logical reasoning rather than something they could have just came up on the spot on. I don't know if they did, maybe. Thirdly, they say we don't defend, we say, okay, yes, we don't defend choice, so we are outside of the motion. In our first speech, we say we see that most probably everybody will pick this. This is why we talk about everybody picking this. We prove likelihood in first speech. So we are in the motion. They say, he says, the system makes mistakes. Guys, this comes too late. You should not buy it. This comes in third speech on the mistakes. This is something that should not be bought in the debate. This is constructive. Nobody mentions mistakes in the past 2 constructive speeches. Then, they say, but like slippery slope. This is like me saying, would you take away prisons or any sort of punishment because it violates the basic human rights of freedom of walking? Like, I can also create a slippery slope, guys. It's not that hard. Right, so we should wait on logic. Then, they say, we take people away from violence. Guys, okay, let's go with the comparatives. I don't want to do it the same way. Great. Then, notice, why we win the debate? Firstly, principles are a human construct. Notice, things like proportionality, they're a human construct. Some people, the intuition here is, some people believe the death penalty is moral. Others believe it is not. Some people believe that self-defense in every situation is moral. Some believe it is not in every sense. So principles are ultimately a human construct. Right. I don't believe that this is less essential, especially taking, I don't believe that they prove a principle, especially taking into account the co-consent point. Like at that point it becomes very complicated to determine whether something is principally correct or not. The practice is much more intuitive. Second comparative. Notice, we impact more people. The principle of a few peoples are infringed on their side. The people who have convicted violent crimes. We infringe the principles of every other type of criminal getting stabbed in prison, every victim who doesn't feel any sort of closure, and thirdly, every future victim that gets convicted. I believe these are more people's rights because we impact the future generation in this sort of particular case. So we believe that they infringe the rights of more people. Secondly, why are victims' dignity more important than offenders' dignity? We asked this question from second speech, they never deliver an answer. Offenders choose to do the crime, knowing the punishment, knowing they will be given this choice. The victims did not know that they will get sexually assaulted on the street when they walked in the night. This is the comparative. Fourthly, principles are binary. Either you buy them or not. Ours is on a spectrum. You can buy them to reduce some type. But if they have not proven their principle and not responded to every single rebuttal we give, you cannot buy their only argument in this debate. Vote for us.